Hi, I'm Miss Tyler, and welcome to Context for Kids episode, I think it's 23. Vayikra, and he called, and that's Leviticus 1:1 to 6:7. And this is one of, let's be honest, even adults hate this Torah portion because it's very confusing, very detailed, and very hard to understand. But I am going to make it really interesting for you because this year I have finally learned this to the point where I can understand it and I can make it interesting for you, and maybe even Greg Heffley wouldn't go into sleep in class. So, without further ado, here we go. And Leviticus, of course, we left Exodus. So now we are in Leviticus, and Leviticus is all the instructions for the priest, and it's going to be all about how we deal with the clean and the unclean, and the holy and the profane, the holy being all the things about the temple that we learned about over the last, 6 Torah portions? Leviticus is very different. Every book of the Bible is very different, and Leviticus is very different. But Leviticus is really different. It won't be until we get really into Numbers again that we're dealing with stories about people, although there is a brief exception. So, here we go. Vayikra, and he called. Now, in the ancient Near East, and actually all over the ancient world, and I'm talking about the Americas, North and South America, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Europe, blood was completely different than we see it now. Now we look at blood and we go, oh, we think about gross movies with, blood, and we just think gross. But blood was a fact of life in the ancient world. If you wanted to eat, and you weren't going to eat something that you grew out of the ground, there was blood involved. It really wasn't that big of a deal. Not like and they didn't see, we look at blood and we see death. But the Bible and the people in the times of the Bible, they looked at the blood and they saw life. Now, people throughout time, now this is gross to us. This is actually forbidden in the Bible. All people groups throughout time have consumed blood in order to become like whatever the animal was that the blood came from, and even sometimes human enemies. Some peoples of the world would drink the blood of their defeated foes, especially if it was a great warrior. They would want to partake of that blood so that they could get some of that life force, that life essence, like the power of that person or whatever, amazing attributes they had was somehow contained in his blood. Now, all they knew was that the blood was gone, the person died. All right? Now, it is true that the life is in the blood, and without blood there can be no life. But if you drink the blood of a turtle, you're not going to start walking really, really, really slowly and develop a hard shell on your back. If you drink the blood of a rabbit, you're not going to be able to run really fast. But that was the kind of thinking that they developed, that you become like what you take the life force from. Of course, God forbade this practice. We are not supposed to drink blood. Our gifts, whatever it is that we are, come from Him. Now, like I said, in the Bible we know that the life is in the blood, and that comes from Leviticus 17:11. Now, I'm going to do something a little bit different, and I know I always just do ancient Near Eastern culture, but I'm actually going to teach Torah this week. Because this is a very serious Torah portion, and I've told you in the weeks that have gone past how in other cultures the sacrifices were seen as food for the gods, and it'd all be done behind closed doors, and they really thought that the gods, through their essence that had been brought into the idol, that they were really eating this food, and if they didn't eat the food, they were going to die. Okay? Well, it was all done out in the open, in the tabernacle, in the temple, and that's actually called, if you want to just say something that applies to both the tabernacle and temple, you call it the dwelling place. Okay? And that's called the Mishkan. There's a Hebrew word for you, Mishkan. So when they had the dwelling place of God, all the sacrifices were done out in the open, so everybody could see, well, He's not eating that. And it's all getting burned up. It's not getting roasted and taken into him. This is a God who supplies for his own needs. He has everything he needs. We are not feeding him. The universe is not going to fall into chaos if we don't feed the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So that was unique in the world. All right, so blood is life, like they say in Leviticus 17:11. Blood in the ancient world, especially in Israel, was like bleach. It was, because it was life, it could counteract death. And what's associated with death? Shame, pollution, everything bad. Death was, you didn't want death, and you certainly didn't want death anywhere near the temple of your God. Because to introduce death into a holy place is shameful. And we're going to talk about that. Okay, now, the dwelling place, the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the temple, it's God's dwelling place on earth. And we've talked about that too. It's God's palace. It's his place. It's his holy, set apart place where everything has to be perfect because he is perfect. And we can't just go anywhere we want and go to it anytime we want and do whatever we want. We have to do things his way. So, the temple is God's palace on earth. What is sin? Okay, so we know from the New Testament that sin is transgression of the law. All right, and we know also that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But sin is, well, God set up his laws in Exodus, okay, and they expand upon them, excuse me, all through the Torah and actually the prophets, and there's a whole bunch of laws that expound upon the Old Testament laws in the New Testament. So we've got all these rules of behavior that teach us how to love God and love one another. And when we violate one of those laws, that's called sin, because when we're violating a law, we're either going against God or we're going against our neighbor. When we steal and when we lie and when we do those things, we're hurting our neighbors. But we're also bringing shame on God, whose temple was in the midst of the camp. And later his temple was in the midst of the kingdom of Israel. All right? So when we do sins, it brings dishonor on God's holy palace. There's kind of an invisible pollution, and I'm going to explain that later. You can't always see the effects of sin, but they're there, and they're corrupting God's home. So, what happens, I'll say, the temple's God's home. What happens when somebody's house gets polluted? What would happen if your house gets polluted? What would need to be done? Oh, before we get to that, I wanted to talk to you about the different kinds of sacrifices. Let's just stop right here. So let's go back to we're going to go backwards. Isn't this fun? I just got this. This is my new little toy. This is the first time I've used it. So, we're talking about sin. People think about sacrifice because they think that all sacrifices were for sins. Well, that's actually not true. As a matter of fact, most of the sacrifices weren't for sins. There were sins for whole burnt offerings where you come and you want to present yourself to God. And so you would bring him the best animal of your flock. You would bring either a bull, a sheep, or a goat, or a bird, depending on, how rich or how poor you were, but you brought your best. And that's in Leviticus when we see that, and that would be a whole burnt offering. That's the kind of offering, like if you were going to visit the Queen of England, okay, you wouldn't just go before her empty-handed. Say you were a farmer and your bees produced the most amazing honey. You'd bring her the best that you had, and you'd give that to her to make yourself presentable to her, to show her honor so she would want to accept you. Well, that's the Ola offering. That's the Leviticus 1 offering. No sin about it. Just coming before somebody and showing respect. Like foreign dignitaries come to this country. Okay, we give them gifts. Okay, the Leviticus 2 is the grain offerings. And again, no blood sacrifice. And that is just a gift. That is presenting a gift of grain to God, and then the priest would get some of it. All right? Now, in Leviticus 3, we have got the fellowship offering, and this is, I got a bunch of friends, they call this is the barbecue offering, okay? This is the one where you would go with your animal and you would celebrate a feast with him. He gets part of the animal and it gets burnt up on the altar. That's his portion. He would actually get the best part. He would be getting the filet mignon. Okay, he would be getting the real tender, choice cuts of meat and the fat. Okay, that would be his. He would get that. He deserves the best. And then the priest would get their portion, and then the family would take the rest and they would eat it all in the presence of God. It was a fellowship. Because when you want to become closer to somebody, you invite them over for dinner, right? Well, God wasn't coming to their house. They went to him. So they shared a meal together. That's another kind of sacrifice. See, the word sacrifice in Hebrew is korban. Korban means to draw near. And there are several reasons why you would need to draw near. Like in Leviticus 1. You're drawing near to God because he's great and you want to be acceptable to him. And so you offer him your best. Maybe you're going to make a petition, like Hannah making a petition that she would have a son when she was barren. And then in Leviticus 3, you've got the barbecue. It's Thanksgiving. Something amazing is happening. You take your entire clan and you go to the temple and you celebrate a feast with God out of pure thankfulness. All right? And it isn't until we get into Leviticus 4, 5, and 6 that we start talking about sin sacrifices. And then things start to change. Whereas before, the blood from the sacrifice would just they dip their finger in and they kind of lash it all around the altar. Okay? Now, they start rubbing the blood on different altars depending on who has sinned. And if the sin was unintentional, which means, oops, I didn't know that was wrong and I did it. Okay? Sometimes that happens. There's always things in our lives we don't know they're wrong until all of a sudden we do and go, oops. Okay? And then there was the intentional sin, but not rebellious. That's, when, like my friend Ryan White says, when you see the cookies over there and you know it's a sin to take one because your mom said no. And man, you fight it and you fight it and you fight it. Then you go and get the cookie, but you've sinned against your mom who made the cookies. And maybe she needed exactly that many, but she told you not to have it. And when you take one, you're hurting your relationship with her. Okay? So, that's an intentional sin, but it wasn't, you weren't doing it because you hate her. Then there's willful rebellious sin. It's like you're sinning and you're looking at the person you're doing it to and you're like spitting in their face. It's like, you see what I'm doing right now? It's because I hate you. That is willful rebellious. Okay? And there was only one time a year when that could be repented for. So anyway, let's, but all those sins brought shame on God's house that was in their midst because they were all around it. Okay? And even though it was invisible, the tabernacle still looked great. It was polluting the sanctuary. It was making it more uncomfortable for God to live there and dwell in the midst of the people. Do you remember after the golden calf incident? He says, I don't want to go anywhere with you guys anymore because I'll just kill y'all. I cannot deal with your sin. All right? So, and then later there's a commandment that says, if you do all these things, the land will vomit you out. Because the land isn't going to want you polluting it anymore. And it talks a lot about the sin and the pollution of the land and and the consequences of that. Well, in the ancient world, it was believed, and the Bible explicitly states this, that if the sanctuary, if God's dwelling place becomes polluted enough, he will leave. When he left, when in ancient Israel, The Babylonians came in and conquered them because he was no longer there in their midst. And he lifted his hands, and they were allowed to experience the kind of things that other nations experienced. Okay? So now we're going to talk about the graffiti artist, because this is how I teach this. I was going to teach this yesterday in Louisiana, but the place I was going to teach at, they got flooded out. So, would you be in prayer for the people in northern Louisiana, because they've had terrible flooding. Terrible flooding. So, this is how I want to explain it to you. There was a man, and he bought his dream house in a neighborhood. This is not actually his. I don't know whose house this is. Found it on Google Images. So he bought his dream house in a neighborhood. But the neighbors weren't very nice. And every day they would come and they would bring cans of spray paint. Now, it was invisible spray paint. All right? But he could see them doing it. And they were spray painting nasty things on the side of his house. Well, not everybody was spray painting really nasty things. Some people were just spray painting on his house while he's in it, as though it's not even his house, completely disrespecting him. And all of a sudden, after a while, the entire house is covered with layers and layers and layers of this invisible spray paint. And the man feels so disrespected and so rejected that he moves out of the neighborhood, knocks the dust off his shoes, and goes. And that is exactly what would happen in the tabernacle or temple as this pollution was building up. Now, we're going to go back to the sin sacrifices, because that's what happens when there's a lot of sin. Okay? It's disrespecting God's house. It's dishonoring Him. I wonder if you can hear my rooster. He must be under the porch there. There is solid concrete between us and the rooster, but I can hear him through that wall. Doggone it. I don't know what he's all up about. He doesn't have nothing to complain about. Okay. Anyway, let's go back to the sin sacrifices. Now, with the sin sacrifice, everything is different. One, the people aren't eating with God. They're bringing Him a gift. All right? They're bringing Him an animal. And they're going to, remember I told you life was in the blood? Well, they're going to take that animal and they're going to bring it to the door of the tent of meeting. They're going to lay their hand on it. Okay? And when they lay their hand on it, they're taking ownership of their gift. And they're not laying their sin on the animal. They're not, because you can't do that. Now, here's another thing about sin sacrifices. The sin sacrifice is given after the person's already been forgiven. Repentance is what brings forgiveness, not the sacrifice. The sacrifice means nothing if there hasn't already been repentance. So it's personal repentance that brings sacrifice, or that brings forgiveness, not the sin sacrifice, and I can prove it. Because before the temple existed, you don't see any sin sacrifices. And I'll tell you why later. But we never see a sin sacrifice with Abraham or Isaac or Jacob, even after they did things that were wrong. Even after they did things that would break the Torah laws that had already been set up. They didn't do this kind of sacrifice. Now they'd lean their hand on it, and then they would kill the animal. And they would collect the blood. And here's where everything is different. Now, if you were a normal person, when you'd committed just a run-of-the-mill sin, whatever, you would the priest would put their fingers in, and they would smear it on the horns of the altar. Now, I didn't get a picture of the altar, so I'm probably going to do that when I'm going through, and I'll put in a slide when I edit this. But they would put the blood on the horns of the altar, because if you were a normal Israelite and you sinned against God, you brought shame that went that far towards God's throne. And that blood that you laid your hands on, that animal, that blood is removing your dishonor from the altar. Okay, does that make sense? Now, if you were a leader, or a priest, especially if you were a priest, and depending on the severity of the sin, the dishonor could go and even dishonor the altar of incense inside the holy place. And then the blood from that animal that was brought would have to go on that altar. And once a year, for the terrible, willful, rebellious sins, the sins that corrupted and polluted God's own throne, the Ark of the Covenant, the high priest would go in after purifying himself, and he would go in there and he would make atonement for the nation, and blood would be sprinkled. Okay? He wouldn't even touch it, but he would sprinkle the blood to remove the shame that the children of Israel had brought on the ark. And I know that goes against what most people teach, but this is the way that the Jews saw it. This is the way we see it in the writings. And you'll see it in the Bible as you're reading through this Torah portion, that atonement is made for the altar. Atonement is made for you. The sin is being forgiven off of the altar. The dishonor is being taken off the altar. See, we don't need the temple to be rebuilt again so that we can do sin sacrifices as though we aren't forgiven. Even before Yeshua came, repentance was all that was required for sin. The sin sacrifice was all about removing the pollution that we sinning graffiti artists put on God's house, because the things that we do that are bad, they make him look bad. You know, it's like if a normal person goes, if a normal American goes overseas, like to England or France or just some other country, and they behave badly, well, it brings some shame on our country. If a senator or congressman go over and behave badly, it brings a lot of shame on the country, and there's going to have to be a public apology forthcoming. If the President of the United States goes to another country and commits a terrible sin, that brings enormous shame on this country. So the pollution that it brings on our country has to do with the rank of the person who sins. It's the same thing. Okay? Older children can bring more shame on the family than younger children can. Does it make sense? I hope so. Anyway, so that's the cleaning off. All right, so let's go back to the graffiti artist here. Now, what would happen if, before it all got bad, if before the man moved out of the house, all the neighbors came over and they brought him a nice side of beef, and they say, you know what? I'm sorry. We disrespected you. We dishonored you. We were wrong. We're sorry. We're bringing you this side of beef. Please enjoy it with your family. And we brought buckets and sponges. And no matter how long it takes, we're going to scrub. Each one of us is going to scrub our own graffiti that dishonored your house off of your house. Well, then the man's house is cleansed again. And he's not disrespected anymore. Now he's honored. Restitution has been made. And now his house is livable again. It's not polluted anymore. There you go. That's the sin sacrifice. The sin sacrifice washes the shame away from God's temple. And the atonement of the blood, like the wet sponge on the house, was there to wash away pollution. But if there was no house, then no one would have ever disrespected it, and it wouldn't be polluted. In the same way, when there's no temple, there's no need for sin sacrifice. If you want to know why the Jews want the temple back, and frankly why I want the temple back, is for the other sacrifices, the other offerings, the Thanksgiving offerings, and the things that we do in front of the eyes of the world to honor God, and for the worship that went on in the temple, and that it would be there as a city on the hill with in these days with 24/7, 365 webcams showing God's great and glorious house and everyone in the world would be looking at it. And God would be honored. And then we have to deal with sin, polluting that one. I'm going to tell you another thing. When Yeshua died, and he went up, and he took his place as the Melchizedek priest in the heavenly temple, because the Melchizedek priesthood is a divine priesthood. Okay? Only Yeshua can fill that role. And he went up and he became a high priest in the earthly, or in the heavenly tabernacle, because he was tribe of Judah. Couldn't be a priest on earth. That priesthood was given to the house of Aaron forever and ever and ever in an eternal grant covenant. But in the heavenly tabernacle, no such law exists. And Yeshua became high priest. When Yeshua died, it was a grave dishonor to God. The priesthood, that was a corrupt priesthood. See, they weren't even real priests. The family of Annas and Caiaphas, they weren't really priests. They were normal people who bought the priesthood from the Roman government. And so they were committing crimes in the temple. They were polluting it. And they conspired with the Romans and got Messiah killed. Okay, Jesus, Yeshua. That was the gravest dishonor that had ever been committed against God. And so when Yeshua went up into the heavenly tabernacle, he applied his blood to the place that had been defiled, the heavenly holy of holies. And he did what the blood of bulls and rams could never do. Blood of bulls and rams could not provide atonement for that sin. It was willful, unrepentant. But Yeshua doesn't have to wait for Yom Kippur one day a year. At any time that we accept him as our Messiah, and he removed our part of that shame that was brought into the heavenly tabernacle by his death, his crucifixion. Okay. Now, after Yeshua died, I don't know if you know this, but in the Talmud, Yoma 39a, I think that's right. Sounds right. For the Jews record that for the 40 years before the destruction of the temple, now this is the 40 years after Yeshua died, the Yom Kippur sacrifice was never accepted by God. The red ribbon that they would hang out stopped turning white. And the menorah wouldn't stay lit. And the temple doors wouldn't stay shut. Because of the corruption of the Second Temple period at the end. Because of Rome, and because of the family of Annas and Caiaphas. The temple had become so polluted that nothing could cleanse it anymore. But, like I said, we have the heavenly tabernacle, and Yeshua serving as our high priest now. But we start out with another temple. It's a clean start. And God can have an earthly place to be exalted again. Not to replace Yeshua, because Yeshua loved the temple. The only time Yeshua ever seems to have really gotten livid and went, for all intents and purposes, berserk, was when they were robbing pilgrims who'd come to the feast who were trying to pay their half shekel. And they were charging them interest to buy that half shekel with their currency from the other parts of the realm. When Yeshua was 12 and he got lost at Passover, where did he get lost? In his father's house, and he was teaching there. And he taught his disciples there. Yeshua loved the temple because Yeshua knew that the temple was about bringing glory to his Father. What Yeshua wants, we should want. To bring glory to the Father. And the temple doesn't take anything away from Yeshua. Yeshua loved the temple. Anyway, so that was a serious one, but this is a very important thing to get. And I want you to really understand it. And if you have any questions, if I skipped over anything, check out my blog this week because I wrote about a lot of this. Parents, you may want to check it out because I gave a little bit more information. It's a hard concept, but I'm hoping that now you can look at Torah portion Vayikra, Leviticus 1:1 through 6:7, and begin to see the patterns and begin to see that they aren't at odds with anything that Yeshua came to do. It's all about honoring God's house and honoring God. Isn't that awesome? Isn't that awesome? So, anyway, that's it for this week, and I'll see you next week. I hope you enjoyed this. Love you. I'm praying for you. And I hope that you have a wonderful time this week studying the scriptures together. Have a great week.